arrived at work at 8 last night. The store was completely empty. Since this station is located on a side road off the main route, I assumed that the night would be rather straightforward. Actually, that was the case until a new expressway was constructed around 10 years ago. Almost every company that was present was forced to leave their previous building empty as a result of this. Because of this section of road has a large number of abandoned buildings that the local drug dealers frequently claim as their own. Anyway, I realized that I only had an hour left in my shift at around 11, and that I should actually get some work done rather than idly sitting around. I work the shift alone because I'm 18, which is fantastic because it allows me to pretty much do everything I want. Normally, I love this since it allows me to do anything I want as long as I do the tasks at hand. We were almost out of barbecue chips, so I realized I would have to go get some from our storage area, which is, strangely enough, located in the station's basement. For some reason, I've always detested going down there. It makes me uneasy. About halfway down the stairs, I heard footsteps moving toward me and something fell on the other side of the room. I panicked like a crazy person as I ran up the stairs and shut the basement door. I checked the security cameras by going behind the counter to the store computer when I returned upstairs. When I turned to the one that faces the basement, I saw this man standing there grinning at the camera. Although he appeared completely insane, he didn't resemble the typical local junkie. He had a clean-shaven head and appeared to be wearing pants and some sort of button-up shirt. To be honest, I wouldn't have noticed if he had simply walked into the store. Instead, he was down there and was grinning into the camera. It gave me the chills. When I first called the store owner, he was rather irate. I called him in the middle of the night, but his tone changed when he realized how terrified I was. He informed me that he would arrive in 15 minutes and asked me to make sure the man stayed put by locking the store's main door. He didn't want me to call the police just yet when I inquired whether I should. I shut the gas station door and turned my attention back to the man. He remained there, gazing up at me with a smile. After staring at me for about 3 minutes, he moved out of the camera's field of view. Not long after, my boss arrived bearing a shotgun, and as soon as I allowed him inside, he headed straight for the basement. We didn't find anything, but I went with him since I felt comfortable having someone else there. In the heart of a desolate Midwestern landscape, where sprawling fields met the endless horizon, there stood an eerie gas station, an unsettling beacon of isolation in the dark expanse of the night. Its sign, worn and battered, flickered intermittently, casting sinister shadows on the cracked pavement that seemed to stretch on forever. The few who ventured down the lonely stretch of highway knew to approach this place with caution, for it was notorious for its strange and unsettling occurrences. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning travelers to avoid stopping there after dark. For those who dared to disregard the warnings, their tales served as a grim reminder that some places in the world should remain untouched by human presence. It was on a moonless night that Clara and her boyfriend, Michael, found themselves racing down the desolate highway. They were on their way to a music festival miles away, determined to embrace the adventure of the open road. The hours had passed uneventfully, the only company being the radio's static and the hum of the engine. But as the night fell, the gas gauge in the aging sedan plummeted toward empty. Desperation etched on their faces, Clara and Michael decided to risk it all and pull into the ominous gas station that lay ahead, its flickering neon sign beckoning them like a malevolent siren. The eerie atmosphere did nothing to deter them. They needed fuel, and this was their only option for miles. As they rolled to a stop at the creaking pump, the darkness seemed to close in around them, and the stifling silence of the night settled like a shroud. Clara cast a nervous glance around, taking in the flickering overhead lights that bathed the gas station in an eerie pale glow. Her skin prickled with unease. "Are you sure we should be stopping here, Michael?" she whispered.
Before we delve deeper into this spine-chilling legend, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss more real-time horror stories.
He's trembling. Michael, determined to make the best of the situation, replied, "It's just a gas station, Clara. We'll be in and out before you know it." With trepidation, they exited the car and approached the dilapidated building. The creaking of the ancient doors pierced the silence, and they stepped into a dimly lit room. Shelves lined with dusty, expired snacks greeted them, casting long, sinister shadows on the grimy floor. The air was heavy with the scent of old motor oil and neglect. A grizzled attendant, his face obscured by a thick beard, stood behind the counter. His eyes bore into the couple with a disconcerting intensity, as if he had been waiting for their arrival. He seemed out of place in the modern world, a relic from a time long forgotten. "Fill it up," Michael muttered to Clara as he handed her the car keys. "I'll go pay." Clara nodded and took the keys, her gaze never leaving the bizarre attendant. Michael approached the counter, his footsteps echoing ominously in the empty store. "Fill it up," Michael said, reaching for his wallet. But as he pulled out his credit card, the attendant raised a gnarled hand, shaking his head slowly. "No card," he grumbled in a raspy voice. "Cash only." Michael's heart sank. He had no cash on him. "I'll just run to the ATM," he stammered. But before he could make his exit, the gas station door swung shut with an eerie creak, trapping him inside. Panic surged through his veins as he realized he was trapped with the unsettling attendant, who now seemed more menacing than ever. Clara, outside by the car, felt a sense of unease as the minutes ticked by. Michael had been gone too long, and her instincts were on high alert. She cast a wary look towards the gas station, her heart pounding with fear. As she mustered the courage to investigate, Clara was startled by the sound of her own name being whispered on the wind. It was a haunting voice that seemed to echo from the shadows, calling her deeper into the... I used to work in a gas station, but the title made that obvious enough, I guess. It wasn't a place in the middle of the city, but it wasn't way out in the countryside either. It was one of those awkward in-between areas, where mostly it's just low-end houses, fast food joints, and gas stations like the one that hired me. The station was on a 2-lane road that wasn't far from a major highway, and we got a lot of people stopping in for gas who were on their way to the beach for the weekend, or just passing through on their way to the cities around us. Typical of any gas station like the one I worked at, if I do say so myself. But you see, that was during normal hours. Once the sun went down, oh, that was when the fun really started. That was when all the freaks showed up. Late at night, all the shadier customers would show their repulsive faces. Drunks would stumble through the doors and keep on going right for the back wall, where we kept all the alcohol. Teenagers would slink in, trying to buy cigarettes. I'd ID all of them, and some of the cards they showed me looked fake, some didn't. To be honest with you, I didn't really care. If they wanted to wreck their health, it was their business. Potheads would wander in too, and load up on chips and ice cream. Oh God, the ones who would buy ice cream were a funny bunch. More often than not, they'd ask for a spoon with their ice cream, and we only had the crappy plastic kind. I had one idiot stand there for 20 minutes trying to scoop the desert into his mouth with one of those bendy spoons. One time, a guy shoplifted the store right in front of me, around midnight. Then he walked outside, called the cops on himself, and just stood there in the parking area waiting for them to show up. I had followed him outside, and I asked him what his deal was. He looked at me and said that he just wanted a place to sleep for the night. I hadn't expected that, but I told him that if he wanted to sell the story, then he should keep running. That he did, he walked off the property and down the small road. I heard sirens not long after, but I suppose I should tell you about the big one. The fucker who made me quit that job. I have a tendency to ramble, and like I said, I try not to think too much about this guy. It was another graveyard shift, another night of my life spent behind a cheap wooden counter. I was pissing my life away, but I was doing it for some money, so it was all good. And I was better off than most of the people who walked through those doors anyway. It was 2:20 a.m. or so. I remember staring at the clock in boredom, watching the 2 dots of the display tick on and off as it counted the seconds. That was when I heard the bell over the door, and I looked up to gauge the person who had just stepped into my little world. He was only a little over 5 feet tall, and looked like he could be 50 years old, easily. His skin was rough and saggy. His arms and legs were dotted all over with tiny white hairs, matched by equally white hair which hung down in long reams from his head. It was scraggly and matted together. You know how hair gets if you don't take a shower for like 2 days? This guy looked like he'd spent 2 weeks without the good graces of any shampoo. He slowly walked his way over to the counter, mechanically, like each step was a deliberate action. Finally, he made it over to me, and he thumped his hands onto the counter for support. His hands were crisscrossed with varicose veins. They looked like cracks in broken glass. Lines of black grit ran underneath the edges of his fingernails. He finally opened his mouth to speak, and gave me a good view of his slimy yellow teeth. Fucking disgusting. He asked in a croaky voice where our bathroom was, and I just pointed sternly toward the back corner of the room. There was a little hallway which held doors to the storage rooms and one small bathroom. He lumbered off in that general direction, and I silently thanked God that weirdo was out of my face. I heard the door click shut. Once again, I was by myself, for the most part. The station was silent for 5 minutes, then 10, 15. It started to get weird. How long this guy was taking in the bathroom. If this were a normal-looking guy, I wouldn't have questioned it, but the man in there was anything but normal. At the 20-minute mark, I journeyed out from behind my counter and toward the bathroom. I knocked on the door a couple times and asked if the guy needed any help. I heard him mumble from the other side that he was fine, but he didn't sound all that fine to me. I wasn't about to argue with him though, so I just walked back over to the counter and sat down in my chair. Another 10 minutes went by and that guy still hadn't come out of the bathroom. I was getting agitated at that point. Eventually, I started hearing a noise. At first, I couldn't really tell what it was, but it didn't take long to figure it out. I was hearing moaning. I started walking back to the bathroom once again. This time, I could tell as I neared the door that something definitely wasn't right. It sounded like the man was in pain, maybe even afraid. Sheepishly, I knocked on the door once again, and for a while I didn't get a response. But eventually, the man managed to choke out 2 simple words: "Help me." His moaning was getting louder and turning to yelling. I started hearing banging coming from inside the bathroom. I could even feel it shake the floor just a little. I went for the knob, but of course the man had locked himself into the bathroom and hadn't gotten around to actually trying to unlock it. I was panicking a little. I didn't know if this was just a bad case of the runs or something like that, or if it was something more serious. I started to think that the latter was true, but there was a rancid stench that was beginning to make its way out of that damn bathroom. It could have just been some horrible diarrhea, I thought. I shuddered a little bit at that. I shouted at him to open the door. He had to unlock it if he wanted help, of course, but he wasn't listening to me. He had started babbling some incoherent nonsense about how he had to keep the door locked because he was only safe in that room. They were coming for him, he said. I kept shouting at him to unlock the door, but he was off on a horrible tangent about how they were coming for him and how they had finally figured him out. All the while, his slurred speech was punctuated by cries for help. He just kept shouting for help. I kept hearing banging. I was freaked out, and in that moment I didn't figure I had the time to call the cops or anything like that. The man's speech was trailing off, and he sounded like he was in a very bad way. I'd like to say that I didn't freak out, that I knew what to do, and handled the situation in a respectable way. But I did none of that. I spent the next probably 5 minutes pacing in that little hallway, my hands pressed to my head in desperation while I tried to think of something, anything to do. The man's yelling and flailing had stopped, I noticed, and I was desperate to do something. Finally, I was struck with inspiration. I went into the storage room next to me, and I grabbed a rolling dolly that we used to move some of the heavier crates around. Then I rushed back into the hallway, and with all the force I could muster, which must have been a lot thanks to adrenaline, I bashed the door wide open. The smell that hit me almost made me throw up right then and there. I dropped the rolling dolly and stumbled away from the room, gagging. I almost fell over, but I steadied myself on a wine shelf. I had to take a moment to catch myself, and it felt like I was going insane. It really struck me then that I needed outside help. So, I did what any sensible person would have done a while back. I called the police. I assumed the worst. In the moment I saw the man, it had looked like he was certainly dead. He was sprawled out on the tile floor, half-heartedly resting against the wall. His back was slumped down, curving in the space between the wall and the floor. His knuckles were very bloody, and pockmarks in the wall which were also licked with blood made it fairly obvious he'd been punching around. It was obvious enough where the smell was coming from. That bastard was sitting in a putrid film of brown liquid. Yes, he'd shit himself. He wasn't even on the toilet, for Christ's sake. Fucking hell. I was still on the line with the police. I did my best to describe the scene to them. As much as I really didn't want to know what had happened to that guy in the bathroom, I figured he could still need help. I announced to the operator that I was going back in. I held out hope that he was alive, but feared otherwise. I guess I really went back into that hallway just out of morbid curiosity, more than anything else. I had to pull up my shirt and cover my face with it, to keep the smell from overpowering me. It didn't do too much to help. The guy had a yellowish powder all around his nose and his mouth, as well as a little froth at the corners of his lips. His eyes were bloodshot and glazed over. I said to the operator that it looked like he'd overdosed on some drug. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go outside for some fresh air. I was groggy and mortified and depressed. A man had just died next to me, for God's sake. At the most, I was out there for 5 minutes. I could already hear sirens when I stepped into the cool night breeze. Only 5 minutes. But here's the thing. Here's what really messed me up bad. When the police arrived, they asked me to show them where the incident had occurred. An ambulance was there as well, and the paramedics were getting their equipment. I led them all to the back, and it still smelled horrible. There were still punch marks on the wall, and there was still some of that drug powder dusted around the floor. But the man who'd been laying there was gone. He was just fucking gone, like he hadn't even been there. I don't mean he was gone in the sense that he got up and left. There weren't any boot prints, no streaks of liquid on the floor, no handprints on the walls.